In the realm of biblical history, few topics spark as much debate as the extraordinary lifespans mentioned in the book of Genesis. The idea that ancient biblical figures like Adam and Methuselah lived for centuries has long been a point of contention between skeptics and believers. And for decades, those of us who interpret the Bible literally have been ridiculed for holding these beliefs. Now, while historical and cultural records from various civilizations hint at the possibility of extended human longevity in the distant past, the hard scientific evidence has been somewhat elusive. But this past year, a team of researchers recently uncovered new insights suggesting that pre-flood creatures, including humans, lived much longer than they do today. Joining me now to analyze the research is Dr. Jake Hebert, a physicist and research scientist at the Institute for Creation Research in Dallas. With a PhD from the University of Texas at Dallas, Dr. Hebert has dedicated much of his career for developing creation-based models for the post-flood ice age and climate change. He's the author of several books on these subjects and has recently turned his attention to investigating scientific and historical evidence that supports the extended lifespans of biblical patriarchs. Dr. Hebert, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, David, for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Oh, it is incredible to see you. I can't wait to be with you in person, hopefully in the near future. It's always great to connect. But earlier this year, Dr. Ellis Newham and a team of researchers from Queen Mary University of London published evidence in the journal Science Advances that found that several small Jurassic mammals had these surprisingly long lifespans of like 14 years, something like that. But before we dive into specifics, my first question is, why should believers be interested in this type of research?
Well, this goes straight to, the Bible's credibility. This is one of the most, I'm sorry to say, one of the most ridiculed claims in Scripture, and you have even many professing evangelical Christians saying that we cannot take these ages that are recorded in Genesis literally. And I'm saying, no, we've got evidence that they are literal. And it's coming from some unexpected places, but it's really exciting.
Well, that is interesting, and of course I love any sort of new scientific research, but what you're doing and what you're finding, I can't wait for you to share the complete picture with us. Is there other fossil evidence that animals in the pre-flood world had these very long lifespans?
Yes, and we have to ask a really important question before we even go there. And that is, do we believe that these lifespans are natural or supernatural? Do we believe they're miraculous, or was there something about that pre-flood world and that just naturally enabled these long lifespans? And I am firmly convinced it was natural. I don't see any hint in Scripture that it was supernatural. But that raises an issue. If it's natural, it is very likely that extreme longevity also affected the animal kingdom. And that's because almost any mechanism or mechanisms that you can imagine to explain this longevity would have also applied to the animals. Adam and Eve, they had no mistakes in their DNA, and their immediate descendants had very few mistakes in their DNA compared to what we have now. But that would have also been true of the animals. A lot of people think there was something about the environment. Maybe the atmosphere was a little bit different, maybe a little more oxygen. Well, the animals were breathing that air too. So pretty much any mechanism that you can imagine to explain the human longevity would also apply to the animals. And that's why it's so exciting that we're finding evidence in the fossils that animals were living much longer. Now, most of this is going to be indirect evidence. Direct evidence is somewhat hard to come by, but let me just kind of explain what this indirect evidence is. People who've studied longevity, there's a bunch of studies that people have done on longevity of living animals, and two trends that just really leap out are, one, the bigger the animal is, the longer it lives. That's the general trend. Bigger animals live longer. Of course, we already sort of knew that, right? We know that dog years aren't the same as human years. But also, the longer it takes you to become an adult, the longer you live. There's a bunch of studies that show that trend. So if we what do we see when we look at the fossils? We see abundant evidence of giantism. It's all over the place.
Right.
And we're not talking just about things like dinosaurs. We're talking about creatures that are still around today. The fossil versions are often much, much larger than the living versions, and so that's indirect evidence. Also, we're seeing a ton of evidence for delayed maturation. That's a little bit easier to come by. And then we've also got some direct evidence. And that study you cited from this year is an example. They've found evidence, they can count growth bands around the roots of these fossil teeth of these little bitty mammals. Okay, these little bitty mammals are like shrews. They weigh less than a pound. And yet, based on these counts that they're doing, it looks like they were living to be between 9 and 14 years old. Now, remember, these are little bitty animals, okay?
Yeah.
14 years is the kind of lifespan you would expect for a dog today. These things are little bitty, like shrew-like, mice-like animals, and they are, for their body size, they are exhibiting Methuselah-like lifespans.
Okay, so we're seeing this pattern that somehow correlates body size to longevity, and even in small, tiny creatures,
Yes.
back in the distant past, we're seeing what appears to be this long lifespan. Of course, when you think about things like giant sloths or giant bears or dragonflies with 18-inch wingspans and all, we do see this gigantism in the fossil record, even with normal, regular creatures that we still see today. But then to correlate that to lifespans, which the Bible, correct me, Dr. Hebert, if I'm wrong, but I mean, the Bible is actually talking about the longevity of human lifespans pre-flood. And of course, it doesn't have a good reason to talk about the longevity of animals because, the Lord is talking to us in the Bible about us.
I mean, that's just the way it was. Yeah. Why would you mention it? That's just typical. That's just the way it was. You wouldn't think twice about it. But it's not just, and by the way, these 7 fossil mammals, even the evolutionists said these were surprisingly long lifespans. Not only that, but they had sufficient data for 4 of these fossil mammals to show that they were taking a very long time to reach sexual maturity. Now, the reason that's interesting is because if you look at Genesis chapter 5, the earliest age at which a biblical patriarch is listed as having a son is 65. That's the earliest age.
Wow.
Second earliest age is 70. Now, maybe I'm a little naive here, but I kind of have a hard time believing that people were hitting puberty at 13 like they are today, and everybody was just choosing to wait 50 years before getting married. I just have a hard time believing that. That is strong evidence that humans were experiencing delayed sexual maturation. We're seeing that in these small mammals, and we're also seeing evidence of delayed maturation in some oysters. You got fossil oysters where there is direct evidence that they were living longer. They were about twice as large as modern day oysters, and these are oysters in the same genus. Okay, so in a biblical sense, these are almost certainly the same Genesis kind, and they were taking longer to mature. And we see other evidence of this as well. I can give you other examples where we're seeing evidence of delayed maturation, even fossil crocodilians, fossil sharks. I mean, we're seeing quite a bit of this stuff.
Yeah. So you mentioned that growth bands and fossils provide evidence for pre-flood longevity, but can you kind of describe to us how paleontologists are using growth bands to determine age and the growth patterns of ancient organisms?
Well, there's different ways. For the mammals, you can use these growth patterns around the roots of the tooth. And one thing that's exciting about this is before they would not really try to do this with what they would consider really old fossils because previously it required you to destroy some of the fossil material. So I think the very first time they've done this on a old, say Jurassic fossil, something older than Cenozoic, was 4 years ago. and they're already finding all kinds of stuff. Now, what's exciting about this is they could end up finding even more stuff now that they know they have a way to age these mammal fossils without destroying them. But you've also got, for instance, the shark vertebra. Fossil shark vertebrae are relatively rare, but occasionally they are preserved, and you have growth rings in those vertebrae, just like tree rings. And I'll give you an example. They've got a megalodon vertebra that has what appear to be 46 growth bands. Now, if you assume that each one of those represents a year, and I'll admit that's not airtight, okay, because in some cases you can have sharks that may have 2 growth bands per year for at least part of their lifetime. Other times you may have sharks where the number of bands differs from vertebra to vertebra in the same shark. However, that's the typical assumption. That's usually their default assumption. The default assumption is that 1 growth band is per year. Well, if you look at those growth bands in the shark vertebra for this megalodon, they are evenly spaced. And what that means is, if you assume that the body length is proportional to the spacing between those growth bands, that means it was growing at a constant rate, essentially.
Incredible research, and I want to thank you, Dr. Hebert, for addressing this on the show, and I also want to thank the Institute for Creation Research. You guys are incredibly amazing. So thank you again for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. It was my pleasure.
Absolutely. And we will be back to highlight some of your stories and experiences after the break here on the Genesis Science Report.